Aslak.
Yay! Hello, everybody. Happy to be here. I'd like to thank the team at the Adam State for inviting me or letting me speak. It's a really cool event. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm happy to be back at least in digital form. Just a comment on the title. I it might be a little misleading because I'm not really a tech animator. I'm an animator who have to deal with technical issues more often than I would like. So this talk will be more for people in similar situation to mine, like in indie studios, who have to do a lot of those things themselves. And to those of you who are actual tech animators, I'm sorry for the abominations you're about to witness. I'm joking. I'm not sorry. I'm ready to get started. This presentation will be mainly about useful things I've found while trying to solve rigging problems in Blender. I'll try to sort of talk about things that aren't so standard, that aren't already like extensively covered on YouTube. And I'll be showing some examples of things I did that worked and things I did that didn't work so well. And yeah, I won't be talking about dancing. I just put that guy there because I was worried to be bored with my introduction. So I hope this can be useful to some of you. And useful or not, I'd be interested to hear what you think at the end. You can easily find me on Twitter, so feel free to share your thoughts. I should probably introduce myself. My name is Aslak. I want to be an animator, but I find myself often doing lots of other things. And I live and work in a city called Bergen in Norway. And it's the rainiest place in Scandinavia. So obviously it's a great place to do game development because we don't really want to go outside. And I work at a company called Rain Games, where I've been working for the last 10 years. So it's been a long time. And when we started here, it wasn't much of a game industry in Bergen to talk about, so we basically had to start our own thing or move somewhere else. And the first game we made was called Teslagrad, and it was a
Hi everybody, I'm Aaron Gilman.
Puzzle platformer. And even though it was mainly hand-drawn animation, we also did some puppet style animations that we use 3D software for, sort of 2.5D. And since we had bad finances back then, we did use a lot of open source software. So Blender was the natural choice, and that's how I started using Blender. And I quickly encountered the problem of having to rig stuff before I could animate it. So, and since I was the only one that actually done any animation or like 3D animation before and done any rigging, it sort of fell to me to do it, even though I wasn't super great at it. And so, that leads me to my first example, or my first failure. It was still a total failure. But basically, I had to rig this boss creature, and I rigged it like I would have in other 3D software, using empties as controller objects, and didn't occur to me that would be a problem, because even in Blender, even the tools for setting up IK controllers sort of defaults to using empties. So it seemed like the right choice. But of course, when all the animation curves were on like empty objects that were external to the armature, I couldn't use the action system to split up my animations, and I had to do all that animation splitting in Unity instead, which I found to be cumbersome. I mean, it's not the end of the world, of course, but it was sort of impractical. And it's been a lot of those things that I sort of found out after the fact, and then when it's too late to go back and fix it. And it's been happening several times, I feel, with Blender that it's too late to change it after I found out the right way of doing it. So how did I solve that? I base my stuff of other people's work. The Rigify add-on that comes with Blender, I've been relying a lot on that, and I think like lately a lot of updates that have been made to it are pretty good, like the parent space switching of the IK controllers they recently added. So that leads me to my first useful thing. I currently use that parent space switching to set up a simple and usable sort of rig for grabbing object or holding objects. So I'm going to show you a little bit how I set that up. Now, it's based on a constraint called the armature constraint, and basically you can select which controller you want to be the parent of the IK hand from a list, and then I can sort of piggyback on that feature and add an object to that list so that the hand can follow the controller for the object. So this first step is to set up a couple of controller bones and a deform bone. So one sort of main controller that moves both the IK hand and the object together, and then one that moves just the object. And then I have the deform bone, which I parent to the form bone of the hand. And I use a constraint to move that with the controllers. Now this sort of setup, of course, makes it easier to use animation blending in Unity, because the animation channels on the actual deform bone only contain motion relative to the hand. Okay, so next step, I set up or I changed, like there's a property on the one of the control bones, what the bone called the upper arm parent, which is like the bone shaped like a cog wheel on the shoulder in Rigify. And it has a property called IK_parent. That basically is a range that has the number of entries in the list, and I have to sort of extend that range so that it has one more entry in the list. And then we get to the armature constraint. It has already targets for all of the bones that are supposed to be parents, and we have to add our new object controller bone to the end of that list. So you find that armature constraint by selecting this bone that I've named here. It's just hard to say the name. And then on that armature constraint, you also have to add a driver to the target bone so that you can switch it on and off. And you just copy paste from one of the others and change the number so it's the last number in the range. And then the slightly tricky part is modifying the Rigify script. And but it's not super hard. You just search for the name IK_parent, and then you find this list, and you add your controller bone to the end of that list. Actually, there are two like 2 copies of this list for some reason, so you have to add it to both of them. Don't know why. And then you can animate. And I like this this setup because you can both like get it to have like handle an object in the fingertips pretty easily, or like spin the object around in the hand. So I find it's a useful setup. And piggybacking my work on an existing feature in Rigify makes it pretty fast to do. So I find it useful, and that's why I wanted to share it. Right. So basing my work off of someone else's, of course, it has some drawbacks as well. Can't always get what I want. I can always manage to do exactly the thing that I want to do. But we have limited resources at our studio, so I have to accept that. But accepting good enough is hard because I can be stubborn, and some of my biggest failures, I guess, have come from insisting for too long that I could do a thing and I couldn't really do it. So that leads me to this example. We made a game called Mesmer, which was a very dialogue-heavy game, and we were supposed to have a lot of characters that the player could talk to, and we wanted there to be like close-ups of the character that you were speaking to. And so I wanted to build a proper face rig to animate with, because I always wanted to do more face animations. And I tried a few pre-made rigs for it, but I couldn't get it to give me the expressions that I wanted. So very, very foolishly, I set out to build one of my own from scratch. And that ended in me spending way more time setting up characters than actually animating anything, because it was just a lot more work than I expected. Um, all that work spent building a sufficiently precise rig was just wasted. Yeah. No, but I'm trying to learn my lesson. Honestly, I am. Someday I will. And the new project we're working on, I am using again, basing it on existing rigs. But of course, there's a problem that this is a game with a lot of creatures in it, which I'm excited about. I enjoy animating creatures, but of course they have a lot of non-standard parts again. So I have to find other ways of speeding up my workflow too. But anyway, that leads me sort of to the next useful thing. Exporting bendy bones to Unity. So in Blender, you have this nice system called bendy bones for making squash and stretch rigs. Of course, Teslagrad 2 is a stylized game, so it's obvious that squash and stretch would be a nice way to do stylized animations. So it just makes it makes everything really lively. But there's always a but in there. This is a very small but, so it's fine. Unity doesn't really like scaling bones in a hierarchy. So we have to do some workarounds in order for it to work properly. So the bendy bones feature in Blender is really useful for creating, of course, squash and stretch effects. You activate it by activating the B-bones visualization on the armature, and then you can sort of segment the bone into several sub-segments. and they are controlled by a curve. The curve is there, but you can't see it. The only problem with this in Blender, of course, is that there's a bit of setup. It doesn't, like, you can't just click it on, then it works as you would expect. So there's a bit of setup where you have to set up some controller bones and some constraints, and you have to activate the easing function on the curve, and then you can get sort of the curve to change easing, the amount of easing on it. And finally, you can like animate some nice fluid, stretchy effects. And then, it should be just exporting that to Unity, but there's always a bigger but. This happens. There's no stretching going on at all. Why? It turns out the bendy bones, being like a substructure to the regular bones, they don't export. And like I've been searching for a way to actually export this for a really, really long time. And I sort of stumbled upon a solution last year, which is basically, again, the armature constraint. Because you can use the armature constraint to one bone to deform another bone, or one set of bones to deform another set of bones. So I figured, if I just use the bendy bone to deform a set of regular bones, I can use those regular bones as deformed bones and export those instead. And that works. Of course, like I mentioned, Unity doesn't like scaling in a hierarchy, so I actually have to unparent those bones from each other and use some constraints to make them extra constraints to make them point at the next bone in the chain. But it works reasonably well. And then it exports to Unity, which is great. Of course, it's not perfect. Like the joint scaling issue is not insignificant. I mean, when you're using this, you can't really use animation blending properly, because since there are actual transformation animations on the bones, you easily get weird offsets when you're blending animations together. But I get around that by just using old school transition animations, like I make by hand, because the animation set of this particular monster isn't really that big. But depending on your situation, you might not be able to use this. So try like the convoluted way that I had to sort of make this thing work. I feel that's very common in Blender. I encounter this situation where there are like a piece missing always that I have to search for a long time. It's not just the case for rigging features. It's like the animation features as well. Take the post breakdown tool, for example. For the longest time, it didn't have any visual feedback, so to begin with, I thought it didn't even do anything. And I mean, I'm not super perceptive, so I really, really need visual feedback. So, for example, you activate the post breakdown tool and you start blending between the next and the previous frame. That works fine. But down at the very bottom, in a tiny, tiny writing, are now the breakdown tools options. It has options. I mean, come on. Like my eyes are up there on that nice new blending percentage bar they recently added. I'm not going to notice the thing down for them, and those options aren't even available from anywhere else. So I mean, and they're useful, right? It's fine. I mean, Blender, we're still friends, but keep this up. I'm gonna need some time apart. That's all I'm saying. What was my point? Yeah, my point. Blender has a lot of nice features, even though people sort of talk about how it's missing a lot of things. It usually I find that you can sort of dig around and find the things that people say that are missing from it. It's just you're not likely to find it all on your own, basically. Anyway, moving on to my final trick. Overlapping action is an animation feature that I find I never really have time to do properly, because it does take a lot of time to animate. So I have been wanting to find ways to sort of speed up that workflow. That led me to this sort of next trick. I wanted to try to bake a simulation onto bones so I could support it with the rig. Because overlapping action can be handled pretty well by simulation. And I mean, you could use Unity Cloth, for example, and do it in real time. But since it's a platform game I'm working on and it has sort of instant reactions to input, if I was fine with the character wearing her dress over her head most of the time, it could work. But I want to have more control, basically. And there's this feature in Blender. It's called vertex parenting, which allows you to parent a thing to vertices on the mesh. And I exploited that feature to sort of bake the animations onto bones in the rig. So just to take you through like the steps here, I set up a simple simulation mesh, and then I parent the bones to the vertices of that mesh. The one problem is that the bones themselves don't support that feature, so I had to sort of use empties as an intermediary to be able to parent it to the mesh. I mean, it's only a nuisance in Blender, so I don't export the empty objects or anything, so it's not a big problem. But then I can move the bones with the simulated mesh. I think there are other ways of doing it too, like with constraints, but I couldn't get those to work as well as this. This was sort of a little bit simpler. And then I also needed some control over this, because the straight up simulation, of course, doesn't work. So for artistic control, I added a control bone, and I pinned the simulation to that control bone so that I can point the simulated mesh in the right direction, basically. In order for that to work, I have to use bone envelopes on the armature modifier, because straight up vertex groups, I didn't get the right, it didn't get it to work properly with vertex pinning group. And then I bind the final mesh to those bones that are being moved by the simulation. And that, of course, the advantage here is that that mesh can be any complexity I would like, not as simple as the actual simulation mesh. And then I bake the pinned, I bake those bones to an animation, and I can export that to Unity. So, of course, I mean, like I said, there are some advantages to this. I get like a predictable result. I can have some artistic control over it, and I can keep it in one place. I don't have to export the simulation as a separate thing and sync it up in Unity. Of course, some drawbacks. it has a few steps to set it up. You still have to be a bit careful with the blending because the simulate like the animation doesn't look quite right when you're blending it. But like the biggest problem, I guess, is the number of bones you end up with, because you can quickly end up with a lot of bones. For this case, this character is just one character that uses this, so it's fine, I think. But another thing is that of course it spams in Blender. It spams your console with dependency cycle errors. But the bones that are being simulated and the control bone aren't actually dependent on each other. So I think it's fine. At least, I got away with it this time. So, I mean, I think the final result, it was an upgrade or what I had. Even if I would have liked to animate this by hand, I didn't really have the time. So, I mean, it might sound strange, but I want to animate more and not less. So I'm trying to find other ways to speed up my workflow, not just sort of automating the animation. And so that's why I've been trying to learn how to script, like automate rigging tasks with script lately. I had actually been trying to learn to do that for a really long time. Like I tried to learn Python probably 3 times in the last 10 years. The difference now is there are a lot better tools for learning like Python and the Blender API. I think Blender API probably was my biggest problem, not so much Python. But our point is there are good ways or good resources for learning both of those now that weren't available 10 years ago. So it's been easier for me to learn. So I've been able to, for example, the bendy bolt rig that I showed earlier, I've been able to automate the setup of that rig. So I can do it in 1 click instead of it taking half an hour. And that's super useful. So I recommend doing it if you're in a similar situation to mine. Yeah. I think that's it. Probably need a break now. If there are any questions, I don't know if you have time for them, but I'd be happy to answer them if there are. And thanks for listening.
All right. In the interest of making up a little bit of time, if you have any questions for Aslak, I saw a couple awesome ones in the chat. Please direct them to him at his Twitter. Moobot's posting that in chat. Twitter.com/Aslak Helgeson. Aslak, thank you so much for your time and for your awesome talk. Thank you for bearing with our technical difficulties. And yeah, we'll see everybody in the next talk, which is spacing the implied animation principle.
Bye.